Retirement is the greatest illusion that has ever been sold to the public because since its origins over 2,000 years ago, it has been rooted in one single idea: obedience. I mean, what we call retirement today is a product of over 2,000 years of political strategy, false promises, and societal manipulation. The idea all started in 13 BC when Roman emperors used pensions to prevent aging soldiers from rising up against the state. Centuries later, to then be used by a German chancellor to stop industrial workers from joining a rising socialist movement. The earliest versions of retirement weren't about rest, dignity, or financial freedom, but they were all about managing the masses. Retirement was the carrot on the stick. In exchange for a lifetime of labor and loyalty to the state, you'd be told a vague promise that someday you'd finally get to rest. But the system was built on assumptions that rarely held true, like the state would always be strong, jobs would always be stable, and living to old age was guaranteed. However, despite these cracks, the idea of retirement spread around the world and evolved from military pensions to government programs to self-managed investment accounts. And with every step, the responsibility quietly shifted from governments to corporations to now individuals. We've all been sold this dream that if we work hard today and play by the rules that one day we'll be free. And throughout all of our lives, we've seen this dream vanish before our very eyes as pensions have disappeared. The social security system is starting to crumble. The cost of living keeps rising, and more people are reaching retirement age with no money. However, this dream was never real to begin with. It was never designed for the average person to win, but it was designed to keep us obedient. Retirement has been flawed since its origin, and in this video, I want to take you on a journey to uncover the origins of retirement, how it evolved over time, and how that led us to the broken system we have today. Because once you understand the history of retirement, you understand that it was never designed to work in our favor. And so sit back, relax, grab yourself a warm beverage, and we're gonna dive in to the fascinating story of retirement, where it all started over 2,000 years ago in the ancient Roman Empire with Chapter 1, the origin of the pension. For most of humanity, retirement didn't exist. Life was short, brutal, and there was no such thing as stepping away from work unless you were rich. But over 2,000 years ago, that all changed, and the first real concept of retirement appeared in the ancient Roman Empire in 13 BC under the rule of Emperor Caesar Augustus. You see, at this time, Caesar Augustus had just emerged from decades of civil war. The Republic had collapsed, Julius Caesar had been assassinated, and Rome was transitioning into an empire. And Augustus needed stability, and a strong army was his key to that. However, at the time, the Roman army had many problems that threatened its stability, and there were three major problems. First, they were having trouble maintaining a professional, dependable army. Second, soldiers were more loyal to their generals than to Rome. And third, upon finishing service, soldiers were promised land, but that system was broken and many people didn't receive their land, leading to anger, unrest, and rebellion. And so in order to solve these problems, Caesar Augustus needed to rally the troops, and he came up with a brilliant solution. In 13 BC, he established the first ever state-funded pension plan for Roman soldiers, where after 20 to 25 years of active service, every soldier would receive a lump sum payout from the state, equaling 13 years' salary. And to fund this system, Augustus first used his own money and then later funded it through a 5% inheritance tax and a 1% sales tax. And on the surface, this looked like a reward for a lifetime of service, but in reality, it was a strategic power move because Augustus's reasoning was simple. Pay the veterans off and they'll be less inclined to overthrow you, aligning the interests of the soldier with those of the state. Because creating this pension plan would solve all the problems that he was facing at the time by promising soldiers a reward for a lifetime of service. It professionalized the army, making it viewed as a career. By Rome paying the soldiers, it made them more loyal to the state than to generals. And by giving money instead of land, retired soldiers were free to do whatever they wanted with, preventing unrest. This wasn't just about rewarding soldiers, but it was about gaining control, loyalty, and securing power for his new empire. However, of course, this system came with its flaws. First, many of the soldiers didn't survive long enough to collect the pension, which was around the age of 45. Second, it was extremely expensive and hard to maintain as Rome expanded. And third, future emperors inherited this obligation whether they could afford it or not, which eventually led to delayed payments, reduced rewards, and broken promises. And this system lasted for a while. However, it slowly started to erode over time due to war, inflation, and the collapse of the state. And in 476 AD, with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the military pension system was dead. The Romans were the first to create this idea of life after work and used it effectively to maintain a loyal, professional army. But the idea didn't die with them, because fast forward to the 1800s and the idea of retirement began to reappear, this time in Germany. But this time it wasn't just for the military, but it was for everyone. And let's talk about that in Chapter 2, the invention of retirement for all. The next part of our story occurs in the late 1800s under the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. You see, at this time, Germany was quickly becoming an industrialized nation. And like most countries who were industrializing at the time, it created a large urban working class that faced poor labor conditions, widespread poverty, and insecurity in old age. And because of that, there was a growing interest in the Socialist Party. However, Otto von Bismarck saw this as a threat, and in 1878, he created the Anti-Socialist Law, which banned socialist meetups, publications, and organization. However, he couldn't ban the entire party, and this law didn't stop the growing interest in more socialist ideas. And so instead of crushing socialism, he decided to beat them at their own game. And in the late 1800s, he introduced a number of welfare programs. In 1883, he introduced national health insurance. In 1884, he introduced accident insurance. And in 1889, he introduced old age and disability insurance. And this became the first modern government-backed retirement system, and it was based on mandatory contributions from workers, employers, and the state. And in order to qualify, you had to work full-time, sometimes 70-hour work weeks for 30 years. Which doesn't seem ideal, but it gave workers something they didn't have before: hope for the future. But there was just one big problem to this retirement system. You couldn't claim any benefits until you were 70 years old. And that posed a big problem because in the 1800s in Germany, life was tough, and the average life expectancy at birth was only 42 years old. And even if you survived childhood, you probably still didn't make it to the age of 70. So while the system promised rest and dignity at old age, most people never lived long enough to claim it. They just paid into the system and never received anything. But that wasn't a flaw in the system. That was a feature. It was just the carrot on the stick that gave people hope while suppressing socialist ideals. And so just like how the Romans used retirement as a tool for obedience, Bismarck used it for very similar reasons. To suppress socialist ideals, keep people working, and keep them loyal to the state. However, it didn't really work out, but Bismarck's retirement system left the framework for how many countries would create their modern government-backed retirement systems. And one of the biggest adopters of this system would be the United States of America. And so let's talk about that in Chapter 3, The American Dream, Social Security and the Rise of Hope. So now we've reached the part of the story that more people are probably familiar with. In the 1800s and early 1900s, America was industrializing, which meant that millions of people went from working in rural farms to moving to urban areas to work in factories. And this really changed how society was structured, especially when it came to getting older. In the past, older people could rely on their children or extended family for support. But as families spread out, they had no one to take care of them and no income to live on. The cracks to the system were forming, but it all came crashing down in 1929 with the Great Depression, where the stock market lost 90% of its value, the economy shrank by 29%, and unemployment soared to 25%. Which meant that millions of Americans were left with nothing. No savings, no work, and no safety net. And with so many people unemployed and millions of older Americans living in poverty, it created this pressure of government intervention. And that is when Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the New Deal, which was a set of programs aimed at rebuilding the economy and restoring hope. And one of the biggest programs in this was the Social Security Act of 1935, which was America's first major federal retirement program.
Gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens.
And the idea of this program was very simple. It was a pay-as-you-go system where workers and employers would contribute a percentage of their paycheck to a national fund, and then upon reaching retirement age, 65 years old, retirees would receive monthly payments for the rest of their lives. However, of course, not everyone qualified for this benefit. In fact, in the beginning, about 50% of the workforce did not qualify. Some of the biggest professionals that didn't qualify were agricultural workers and domestic workers, which were held largely by African Americans from the South. And it's important to note that upon creation, you couldn't receive any benefits until the age of 65. And upon birth in 1935, the life expectancy was only 59 years old. However, if you live long enough to reach 21, then your chances of reaching retirement age was 54%. However, despite that, the program was successful and it expanded over time. In 1939, it included survivor and dependent benefits. In 1956, it included payments for disabled workers. And in 1965, it included health insurance or Medicare for retirees 65 and older. And as time passed, Social Security expanded to provide more coverage under more professions. So while the Social Security Act was far from perfect, it did create a system that was much needed at the time. And compared to the system in 1889 Germany, it actually provided real hope to workers that they would be taken care of in old age. And for a brief moment in time, retirement in America actually worked. But it was only because it was a very unique moment in history. And so let's talk about that in Chapter 4, The Golden Age of Retirement. The next part of our story begins in 1945. World War II had just ended, and America came out on top as the world's economic superpower. And business was booming. I mean, the unemployment rate went from an all-time high of 25% in 1933 to an all-time low of 1% in 1944, right before the war ended, and stayed relatively low in the post-war years. And with the war ending, the GI Bill was created, giving veterans access to education, job training, and low-interest loans for housing. Many wartime industries transitioned from making tanks and weapons to building cars, TVs, and refrigerators. And with more people working and no more wartime rationing, Americans were spending more money than ever. This period, spanning the late 1940s throughout the 70s, marked what many call the golden age of retirement. Because for the first time in history, a large percentage of the working class could realistically expect to stop working one day while still maintaining a high standard of living. And this was largely because of three key factors: rising wages, generous employer pensions, and strong unions. Unions were fighting for better worker benefits, and one benefit that became very common was the pension, which guaranteed a worker a paycheck for life once reaching retirement age. And by 1960, 41% of private sector workers were covered under a pension plan. By 1970, that number moved up to 45%, and by 1980, it peaked at 46%. Which completely changed retirement, because not only could people count on Social Security, but they now had a pension. And in 1965, Medicare was passed, so they also had health care. People started not just to be able to afford to retire, but to retire in comfort. And this is when retirement started to be marketed as a lifestyle. There were ads for retirement communities like Sun City in Arizona that promoted an active retirement in a warm climate. Images of golf carts and shuffleboard were creating a new image of retirement, and the AARP was created in 1958 to advocate for retired Americans. Retirement was no longer just the end of work, but it was the beginning of this glamorous phase of life where you finally reap the benefits of a lifetime of hard work. But this golden age of retirement was built in a very specific moment in history. And as it is with all good things, they must come to an end, which brings me to Chapter 5, the unraveling of retirement. The golden age of retirement went from post-World War II in 1945 to around the early 1980s. But then in the 1980s, it slowly started to unravel, decade by decade. The pension quickly started to disappear due to its high cost and high risk on corporations. Heavier regulations imposed by the government to protect employees put more expenses and responsibility on employers, and the decline of unions negotiating these pensions. But in addition to these things, society was also changing. Instead of staying at one job for an entire career, people had multiple jobs throughout their career. There was a rise of individualism and personal responsibility, and people were living a lot longer. And with these changes, in 1978, the 401k was enabled by tax law, which allowed workers to contribute to retirement accounts tax-free, have their investments grow, and then pay taxes come retirement age. And in the beginning, this was created to have for something on top of the pension. However, little by little, it started to become the replacement for the pension because how beneficial it was to companies. It shifted the responsibility and risk of preparing for retirement from the company to the employee. Instead of promising a lifetime of income in retirement, all the company had to do was give a small match to the employee and they were done. The employee had to figure out how much to contribute, where to invest, and how much to withdraw once they reach retirement age. And as we entered the 90s and 2000s, the pension started to become extinct and replaced by the 401k. Yet despite the popularity of the 401k, nearly half of all private sector workers today don't have access to any employer-sponsored retirement plan at all. And at the same time, Social Security was starting to come under pressure for two reasons. First, people were living longer, so people were taking payments for longer. And two, baby boomers were starting to retire. So there were a lot more people taking from Social Security than contributing to it. In fact, in the 1960s, for every one beneficiary drawing benefits, there were 5.1 workers paying into it. Today, that ratio is only one beneficiary to about 2.8 workers. Which means that the system is slowly becoming unsustainable. And what started as a system built on trust between governments, employers, and workers has now morphed into a system of do-it-yourself. You're expected to save, invest, and plan for decades, all by yourself. And if you don't get it right, well, the consequences can be huge. And so I want to finish this video off with Chapter 6, Where Do We Go From Here? All right, let's take a breath for a second. We have covered a lot in this video. We have seen retirement go from a strategy to keep soldiers in the Roman army loyal, to be used to fight socialism in the 1800s in Germany, to a response to an economic collapse in the 1930s, to grow into a golden age of retirement communities and golf carts, to finally start to erode before our very eyes. And so the question is, what do we do with all this information? Well, if there's just one thing that we've learned in this video, it's that retirement has never been simple, certain, or guaranteed, but it's always been shaped by politics, economics, and power, not always with the greater good in mind. And what worked for previous generations most likely won't work for us. And so I want to finish this video with 3 key takeaways. 1, learn to play the game. As we've uncovered in this video, the system is starting to move away from companies and governments holding most of the weight to the individual holding all the weight. And although that's not ideal, that's the reality that we're living in. And so it's very important to learn to play the game. Educate yourself on the 401k, the Roth IRA, employer match, compound interest, how investing works, and how withdrawing works. That way you can use the system to benefit you, rather than waiting stagnant for someone else to save you. 2, don't make the system plan A. As we've seen throughout this video, whether it's with the Romans, Germans, or Americans, systems are never 100% safe, guaranteed, or looking out for our best interest. Empires fall and the world is constantly changing, and so it's important to take action in your own life instead of making the system your plan A. And 3, rethink retirement. Most of us grew up with a very specific idea of what retirement looks like. Work 40 years, stop working at 65, then finally enjoy life. But that idea is outdated. It is built for a world that no longer exists. A world of stable pensions, affordable housing, and low healthcare costs. And so instead of chasing that old model, rethink what retirement means to you. Maybe it's finding work you don't want to retire from, taking mini breaks throughout your career, or living a more simple life where you don't need that much money. The world is constantly changing, and so we must change with it. But the good news is, unlike previous generations, we now have more tools, knowledge, and flexibility than ever before. And if we live with intention, make thoughtful choices, and use the system to our own advantage, we can build lives of freedom on our own terms. Thank you so much for watching. This is the most ambitious, extensively researched video that I have ever made, and it's the direction that I'm hoping to move this channel. And so if this video provided you any value, it would mean the world to me. If you give it a like, consider subscribing for more videos like it, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic in the comment section. And if you're looking to learn how boomers are being pushed out of the workforce into a retirement that they're not prepared for, give this video a watch next. And with that, muchas gracias, que tenga un buen día, nos vemos chicos.